US President Joe Biden and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida have vowed to boost defence ties and present a united front to counter China. The leaders held talks in Washington ahead of their first trilateral summit with Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. It'll focus on the perceived threat from Beijing in the Indo-Pacific.
Three leaders and a set of high-stakes security challenges. President Joe Biden is hosting Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and Philippine President Bongbong Marcos in Washington, D.C. for a trilateral summit following on from an official visit with Kishida. According to the White House, President Biden, Prime Minister Kishida, and President Marcos are meeting to underscore the alliances between the three countries, to bolster economic cooperation, and to foster peace and security in the Indo-Pacific. But there's a threat to that peace and security in the region, and this trilateral summit is at least in part a response to that. Speaking after their bilateral meeting, Biden and Kishida emphasized deepening defense ties between their two countries.
Please have a seat. We're modernizing command and control structures, and we're increasing the interoperability and planning of our militaries so they can work together in a seamless and effective way. This is the most significant upgrade in our alliance since it was first established. I'm also pleased to announce that for the first time, Japan and the United States and Australia will create a network system of air, missile, and defense architecture. We're also looking forward to standing up a trilateral military exercise with Japan and the United Kingdom. And our AUKUS defense partnership with Australia and the United Kingdom is exploring how Japan can join our work.
Although both leaders insisted that the show of a greater partnership is not about seeking confrontation with any one country, the warning to China over its hostile behavior in the South China Sea is clear. The Chinese Coast Guard has repeatedly targeted Philippine vessels with water cannons near the contested Second Thomas Shoal, raising fears Washington could be dragged into a direct confrontation with Beijing if forced to defend its treaty ally, the Philippines. Analysts say that means the U.S. has become interested in making sure its allies are able to help themselves and each other.
The U.S. wants to deepen interoperability with these partners and help them become more capable allies themselves, so that in any future contingency, whether it's the South China Sea or the East China Sea or Taiwan or something else that we haven't even imagined yet, the U.S. has capable, modernized partners who can stand with it. We have to recognize that the unipolar moment is over. And the U.S., its greatest strength is its alliances and its partnerships. It cannot do this stuff alone.
Ahead of the summit, the Philippine ambassador to the U.S. stressed the need to find a peaceful resolution or risk a wider conflict.
And so that is the message that we give to all our friends, that anything happens in the Philippines, you may want to stay away from it, but the fact of the matter is it can become a major conflict that will not, the survival of the world is at stake here.
And beyond the strengthening of the three-way security relationship, Tokyo and Washington are also committing to increased infrastructure and industrial investment in the Philippines, in recognition that standing up to Beijing comes at a cost, both in defense and in economic terms.
And DW correspondent James Chater is following the summit from Taipei. Taiwan not attending, but on the agenda. What signals will it be looking for?
Well, that's right. Taiwan, of course, has no official diplomatic relations with any three of these countries, but it will be watching very closely because China's threats to Taiwan are, of course, the ominous shadow that looms large over any discussion of security in the Indo-Pacific. And I think what Taipei will really be looking at is the strength, really, and the depth of the relationship between these three countries, because the two Asian partners, specifically Japan and the Philippines, would be very critical in a potential intervention if the US did decide to intervene in any potential Chinese invasion scenario of Taiwan. You only have to look at the geography, really, to understand why this northernmost province of the Philippines, a place where the US recently negotiated military access to some bases, and then in those far southwestern Japanese islands like Yonaguni Island, just a few hundred kilometers away from Taiwan. This is also a place which Tokyo has been seeking to remilitarize, deploying more military units there. So really a recognition in Taipei that if they were going to be able to fend off a Chinese attack, it would not only take the implicit support of these three countries, but their smooth cooperation too.
And Taiwan trusts its neighbours would come to its defence if China were to attack?
Well, this is a really important question. It's really the fundamental question facing leaders in Taipei, because despite all the fanfare that we're seeing in Washington this week with the leaders of Japan and the Philippines, it remains a very different prospect whether that senior kind of political sentiment and support really would translate into concrete action should that worst eventuality rise. And then the other important point to make here is that these two countries, Japan and the Philippines, will principally be looking at their own national interests first before any possible scenario over Taiwan. So for the Philippines, that's going to be questions about the South China Sea. And then for Tokyo, of course, concerns about ongoing missile tests with North Korea, which sometimes are flying over Japanese territory. So it's a very different proposition between leaders, stating the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait and actually sending, for example, troops into a potential intervention scenario.
Well, across the strait, how's all this being viewed in China?
Well, China, for its part, has spoken out against the meeting between these three countries. It says that these types of meetings are what's actually stoking what it calls bloc confrontation. This is an argument that Beijing frequently makes against the US and its engagements with countries in the region, that it's in some way trying to limit and curb the influence and rise of China. And of course, China, for its part, is taking its own action. It's drawn much closer to Moscow over the last couple of years, propping up the Russian economy, many people would say, but also reaching out to more international institutions and looking to basically integrate and ingratiate itself with international institutions which kind of create a different type of world order. Organizations much like the BRICS, which we've seen China take a lead on in recent years too.
Good to see you, James, and thanks for the analysis. The survival of the world, let's pick up on that with journalist Sonia Blaszka. She's based in Tokyo. This trilateral meeting is set to be addressing the security threat China poses to the region. What does Japan fear?
Yes, Japan has had a long relationship with China, which has been dominated by two kinds of issues. The first one is territorial issues. 12 years ago, there was the Senkaku conflict. And back then, I would say the situation between China and Japan was even worse than today, because Japan was nationalizing islands that China claimed. And because of that conflict, there were a lot of big demonstrations across China, and Japanese products were boycotted. So they've had their clashes in the past. Compared to that, at the moment, the relationship is relatively okay, I would say. Of course, there are China has been increasingly assertive in the region, and Japan has also showed more strength than in the past, has started to work together with other countries to kind of show, okay, we are not okay with what you're doing in the waters there. And so for Japan, it's really like walking a tightrope. They need to make sure that on the one hand, they show enough strength, but on the other hand, they're very interlinked economically with China. So that's quite tricky, actually, for Japan. Just to add to the territorial issues, if I may briefly, my apologies. Japan also controls the access to the Pacific. So for China, it's of course very important to access the Pacific. But there's the Japanese island chains between Kyushu and Okinawa. So there have been also some clashes between ships and submarines in the past there.
What concrete measures are Japan and its neighbours taking to counter what you call China's assertiveness in the region?
With the Philippines, for example, Japan has worked quite closely together. They've delivered coastal radar systems to the Philippines. Kishida traveled to the Philippines in November to talk about increased cooperation. They've granted the troops access to each other's territories, which is really the last step before a proper and official military agreement, so to speak. So they are increasing their cooperation on many levels.
Journalist Sonia Blaszka in Tokyo.